Hi, I'm Asmus with the Rotochopper Customer Support Team. Today in this video, I will show you how to change the rotor bearing grease on your Rotochopper grinder. Changing the grease out of your rotor bearing housing is necessary to keep the bearings running cool. Dirt and contamination can get into the bearing and the bearing housing, so to keep them running cool and effective, you have to remove the bearing cap and clean the grease periodically. Intervals for changing your rotor bearing grease can depend on screen size, dust, feedstocks, and any water contamination. Basically, the smaller the screens, the more often you're going to have to check this or replace the grease. Typically, you would start inspecting the rotor bearing grease during the $300 maintenance check and replace if needed. If the grease is not contaminated at the $300 maintenance check, repeat this inspection every $100 until the grease requires replacement. In this demonstration today, you're going to need safety glasses, gloves, earplugs, and safety boots. You would also need to follow your normal lockout tagout procedures. In this demonstration, we have the rotor out of the machine, sitting here on sawhorses, so I can show you how this all works. Now let's get down into this. In this demonstration, the rotor bearing cap bolts have been removed already. I'm going to pull the cap off, and you can see that the grease is contaminated and dirty at this point. The grooves for the seal rings are dirty as well. We'll set that off to the side. In here now, we have grease that's dirty in all corners and on the seals. We're going to want to pull that grease out of there and get the bearing cleaned as best as we can. We don't use any cleaners or abrasives. We just simply wipe it out as best as we can with a rag, and we go from there. So now what I'm doing, I'm using our simple little tool. Almost every place that you will be able to find, it's just simple banding. I made a little hook, made a J, and I can scoop the dirty grease out of the housing and clean it from there. Once you have all the grease removed, you're going to want to get all of the seals, the grooves in the seal rings themselves. You want to rotate that seal so you get all the way around the rotor bearing. That's how the dirt and material stays out of the housing. Once you have all the grease removed from the rotor bearing housing, you're going to want to take a feeler gauge and check the clearance on your rotor bearings. Feeler gauges we have here, just your typical feeler gauge you would find out in an auto parts store, except these are a little bit longer. They help make it so you can feed it through the bearing completely and check your clearance. Typical bearing clearance are going to be 3 thousandths. When they're brand new, that's a normal clearance. 3 to 7 thousandths is kind of the range based on if they're a used bearing and how many hours are on them. So what I typically do then is feed this feeler gauge through, go at an angle because the rotor bearings are not aligned straight across, and I'll check my clearance. Normally I go at about a 10 and 2 o'clock position, kind of a diagonal like this. And my 3 thousandths are tight, so that is good. Now that our bearing is clean, our gap is good, it's time to put new grease back into the bearing. What I normally do is take a tube of grease and I cut it in half, and I'll scoop it into the housing and into the bearing cap. The grease that needs to be used, that we use, is a Mobile SHC 100. We have never had a bearing fail from using this grease. So I just take the tube of grease, peel it open, tuck it back into the corners of the bearing housing, and I'll pack the seal as well. It's important to rotate this seal so you get clean grease all the way around. On this size bearing, you typically use 1 tube of grease for a repack or a bearing cleaning. So now you put your tube of grease in your bearing housing, you'd also do the cap. Once you have the cap and the seals done, you'd install your bearing cap and bolts. One thing to remember, after any time that you would do a rotor bearing cleaning, is to check the temperature of that rotor bearing housing after you run. Very important to, if the bearing gets too hot, you'd have to remove some grease. The reason is there has to be room for some of that heat to be inside of that housing. If it would get too hot, a normal operating range would be anywhere from 140 to 180 degrees. You hit 200 degrees on the outside of this housing, remove the cap and see what's wrong. And remember, a well-maintained machine is safer and more profitable. Thank you for choosing Rotochopper for your grinding solutions. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos like these.